Well, hi there! This often comes as a shock to people, but reptiles, like turtles, snakes, and other lizards, can make really good pets. I would say that there are far more people who could properly care for a snake than for a dog or most other common pet mammals or birds. And what comes as an even bigger shock to many people is that there are many reptile species that are very friendly and even affectionate. But not all reptiles make good pets. And not all reptiles that make good pets for beginners. Though I've heard it argued that there is no such thing as a beginner reptile, the truth is that some reptiles are far easier to care for and more forgiving of keeper mistakes than others. And a bad first experience keeping reptiles can be a last experience keeping reptiles. Which is a great shame, as they can bring much joy into your life and, in general, ask very little in return. So we have selected from the host of reptiles that are available today, 5 that we consider to be the best pet reptiles for someone getting into the reptile hobby. Reptiles that are not ridiculously hard to find or expensive to buy, that are hardy and tolerant of slight errors that new reptile keepers are likely to make, and that are unlikely to do anything that might discourage a first-time reptile keeper from wanting to keep pet reptiles. And while all of these on this list are potentially good for first-time keepers, they each have their strengths and weaknesses. Picking the right one for you and your lifestyle is essential. And first on our list is a lizard that made our list of the top 5 reptiles for beginners 8 years ago when we started this channel. The leopard gecko. A lot has changed in the world and in the reptile hobby in the last 8 years, but one thing that hasn't changed is that leopard geckos are amazing pets for a lot of reasons. Leopard geckos have long been one of the most popular lizards in the reptile hobby, for literally decades. And the reasons for that are numerous. Let's talk about some of the pros, and there are many. First, and probably most important, they are absurdly hardy and able to withstand most of the mistakes that new keepers are likely to make much better than just about any other lizard. I once had one escape in my house and go without food or water for months. And he was a little skinny when he came back, but he survived just fine. If you're doing actual research and trying to give them what they need, then they're very likely to thrive. I find that this is one of the more controversial lizards when it comes to the specifics of their care, and I think that this is likely just because they're so tolerant that there are many ways to keep them and have them thrive. And since people are able to keep them well in different ways, they all think that their way is the only way that it should be done, and the internet fights can go on forever. But the truth is that you are very likely to have great success with this lizard. They're also small enough that they don't require a ton of space. There are really many great lizards, but most of them will require more space than a leopard gecko. That isn't to say that leopard geckos wouldn't appreciate more space. They will absolutely use it. But if space is a limiting factor for you, then a leopard gecko might be a really good fit. They also don't eat much. What they may eat, however, may be a con, as they eat primarily insects, but they don't need very many. Just a few each week. So the cost of feeders will be very low, and many of them you could easily breed at home in the quantities that a leopard gecko will need, and you won't even have to get to a pet shop to feed your lizard. And the total care for them is very limited. And since they don't need to eat very often, if you need to leave home for a week or so, you shouldn't really need anybody to do anything for them. If anything, just make sure that they have access to clean water, but they can even go a while without that if worst came to worst. And they're pretty much born litter box trained. It's just that they get to choose where and what that litter box will be. They usually pick a corner of the enclosure to do their business, and they just stick to that corner for all of their bathroom activities. So that makes cleanup easy. And their business is pretty small and dry, and it isn't even all that frequent, so it's really no big deal. You could even set up an enclosure for them with things like isopods and springtails that will clean up for you if you want to get a touch more advanced in your care. They can be obtained very affordably and pretty much anywhere and in a host of colors. I would recommend the breeder of these geckos, Gecko Daddy, if you are okay spending a little more, but you want to get geckos as glorious as these. I mean, look at them. We'll have links to them down in the description. But they're also available at pretty much every pet shop that sells reptiles, so you won't even need to go online to find one. They're also pretty darn handleable for a gecko. They're probably the worst animal to handle of the 5 on this list, but that doesn't mean that they're difficult to handle. unless you're trying to do 3. Like most geckos, they can drop their tails, and in their case, it regrows, but like a misshapen water balloon, so you don't want it to happen. But they're pretty reluctant to do so. That tail is a big part of why they're so resilient. Like the hump of a camel, it's full of fat that can be used as a reserve source of food and water. Losing it is not trivial for them, and they don't surrender it as easily as will some lizards. So there is a ton to like about leopard geckos. But, though they get the highest score we've ever given to a non-snake lizard, they're not perfect. They do have some cons. And I'll start with the fact that these are not as entertaining as many of the other reptiles on this list. Fun per unit effort, they give a lot of bang for your buck. They are a lot of fun, but they're not that active, especially during the day when they sleep, and they're also not that engaging to handle. Leopard geckos live on the ground and in holes. Their climbing skills are limited. Handling them is mostly about keeping them from taking a nasty tumble. And babies can be vocal, defensive, and even bitey. They also, as previously mentioned, can drop their tails. And they can also lose toes if they get shed skin trapped around those little toes, so you need to watch out for that. It's easily avoidable, but a common problem that people have. And they eat insects, which means that you need to be okay with insects and interacting with insects, but not so in love with insects that you can't feed them to a lizard. That can be a deal breaker for some new keepers. But if that's the case, we have a lot of other good options. However, if you think that a leopard gecko might be the best pet reptile for you, you should check out this video next. And should we make updated best pet videos for some of the most common pet reptiles? Or not worry about that and just keep expanding the number of species? I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments. As a dad of 4 kids, I can tell you that life can get loud. Whether I'm working on videos, working out, or just trying to focus, sometimes I need to block out the noise and get into the zone. And that's where my Raycon Everyday Earbuds come in, the sponsor of this video. These earbuds are an absolute game changer. With active noise cancellation, I can shut out distractions and enjoy crisp, high-quality sound. Whether I'm listening to music, a podcast, or my favorite YouTuber, the premium audio is really excellent. 32 hours of battery life means I'm not constantly searching for a charger, and with quick charge, just 10 minutes of charging gives me 90 minutes of playtime. It's perfect for life on the go. A great feature is the multi-point connectivity, which lets me listen to audio on multiple devices, like my phone and my laptop, at the same time. So no more fumbling with the Bluetooth settings when I'm using more than one device. Oh, and did I mention, they come in a ton of stylish colors. Mine are forest green, but you can pick the color that fits your vibe. And if you're ready to upgrade your earbuds, go to buyraycon.com/Clint to get 20% off the best-selling everyday earbuds. That's buyraycon.com/Clint for 20% off. Trust me, I've had a lot of different headphones, and since I got my Raycons, I haven't used anything else. Click the link in the description and hear the difference for yourself. But next on our list is this astounding snake, the Cape house snake, which wasn't on our first list, and we haven't even done a video on them yet, but I think is probably the best pet snake that there is. At least it is the snake that is suitable for the most people. If every household on Earth had to have a snake, and it had to be the same species, and I was in charge of picking that species, this is what I would pick. Cape house snakes are incredible. And both of mine are still rather young. The list of pros for these guys is long. Far longer than they are. For one thing, they're small. Small enough that they don't need a huge enclosure or large feeders, but big enough that you can have a very enjoyable in-hand handling experience with them. I think that there are 2 perfect sizes for snakes. One is a snake that you can hold in your hands that will go through your fingers and engage a lot. And the other is a much larger snake that will sit on your shoulders and give you a bit of a hug. Well, this snake perfectly fits the first category. Also, while many smaller snakes are nervous and quick, these guys are calm and deliberate, much more like larger snakes. And I've never had one attempt to bite me or alleviate itself on me, both experiences that can be off-putting, especially to new keepers. They are hardy as any snake can be. I've heard of them being raised without heat, much access to light, and in very minimalistic enclosures, and developing properly and even breeding in those conditions. I don't recommend this, but it certainly shows that this is hard to mess up. Feeding them is as good as it's going to get for a rodent-eating snake. Most snakes do eat rodents, and I know that this can be a serious con or even disqualifying for many keepers. But if you can stomach feeding a thawed rodent that you purchased frozen from a pet shop or in bulk online, then it doesn't get any easier than this. With most snakes, you will need to make the rodent look alive, and you might need to get the temperature, not just room temperature, but to rodent temperature, as they can detect that difference even from a distance, and may refuse to eat a rodent that is the wrong temperature or doesn't dance like a rodent. This means that you need to be actively engaged in the feeding process and stand in there while the snake inspects the food, then suddenly strikes at it. Not that fun for those of us that don't like opening Pillsbury products. But with cave house snakes, you just thaw the rodent to room temperature, drop it in the enclosure, and walk away. Check back a few hours later. It'll be gone. Though never do that with a live rodent. There are other small, calm, wonderful snakes out there, but most can be difficult to feed at times, which can be the kind of bad experience that may cause a new keeper to choose a different hobby. Not these though. Easiest snake to feed ever, and probably the easiest snake to keep ever. But it does have a few cons. It's a snake, and that can be a problem for some. Though this is one of the best snakes to get you over a fear of snakes. Like many smaller snakes, it can fit through some pretty tight spaces, though they seem much less inclined to try to push through gaps than most colubrid snakes, for example. And this isn't a colubrid. These are actually more closely related to cobras than colubrids, but they have no venom or large teeth or inclination to bite. Anyway, I need to get back to cons. They eat rodents, but if you're okay with the idea of having a snake and feeding it thawed rodents, there really aren't a lot of cons. Be careful having children hold them as they're small, but they're not challenging to handle, so a kid that knows not to squeeze a snake probably can do it. It's really hard to find cons. They're a bit difficult to find, but not at all impossible if you're okay buying them online and having them shipped to you. And I want to talk to you just for a moment about that, because having an animal shipped is really not as scary as it sounds. Any experienced breeder will know how to do this. They will ship it in a well-padded, insulated, and, when necessary, temperature-controlled box overnight. I recommend having it sent to a FedEx hub so it doesn't end up left in the cold or out in the hot sun. And then you pick it up the next day. Be sure that temperatures are not exceedingly hot or cold at any point along their journey, from start to finish, and other than that, everything should go great. Also, just given how excellent they are as pets and how easy they are to breed, as well as a host of glorious morphs already available, I do expect that they will become easier and easier to find over the next few years. And now might be a good time to subscribe and click that little bell if you don't want to miss our full video on these when it comes out, because they're just about perfect. So on our first list, the animal that I included the most reluctantly was the bearded dragon. Their care requirements are often not met by keepers, and they're just more expensive and complicated to keep than anything else on that list. But they are so rewarding that they're totally worth it for many. Honestly, one of the best pet lizards you can get, full stop. If you want a lizard that will just sit on your shoulder and hang out with you, I know of nothing better. But there was another lizard around this size that I would have rather put on that list. They were just too dang expensive. And while they're still more expensive than a bearded dragon, the price of blue-tongued skinks has come down considerably in the last 8 years. They are harder to breed and don't produce as many babies as beardies, so they will always be more expensive. But their care is so much easier, and they are so much less expensive to keep that in all other ways, they're just a better fit for most newer keepers. Not that I recommend this, but blue tongues and leopard geckos are both lizards that people successfully keep and breed in rack systems. You could never do that to a bearded dragon. Again, there are better ways to house them, but it just shows how resilient they are. And their food comes from the grocery store. You can get away without providing live feeders ever. If you're okay with meat like ground turkey or even high quality wet dog foods, then you can feed a blue-tongued skink without setting foot in a pet shop. This is also a very sizable and personable lizard. Like leopard geckos, this is not a climbing lizard. They also live on the ground and down in burrows, so they aren't going to climb all over you or hang out on your shoulder like a bearded dragon. They are relatively rewarding to handle, and for a lizard this size, they do not need quite as much space, though considerably more than a leopard gecko, and they will use basically as much space as you want to give them. So if you don't have room for a 4-foot long or longer enclosure, this might not be a good fit. But if that isn't a problem, then honestly, they may be even better pets than leopard geckos. But they do have their downsides. Both the lizard and the enclosure will be more expensive than that of any of the other reptiles that we've discussed so far, though not the most expensive that we will see on this list. They are fun, but not the best lizards to handle. Though their large size is nice, as they're harder to accidentally harm than would be either of the first two lizards that we've covered. They can technically drop their tails, but it is exceedingly unlikely to happen. They're more likely to bite, and it is a substantial bite. Their teeth aren't too nasty, but their jaw strength is considerable. Fortunately, as long as you pick a less defensive species like a northern or a Maruki, then they're likely only to be defensive like that as babies, when the bite is nowhere near as bad as it would be from an adult, like Stitch here. So I wouldn't worry much about either of those potential issues. What is a bigger concern is that they could lose toes, just like leopard geckos, and for the same reason. So just keep an eye on their toes, especially after they shed. The reality is that if a larger enclosure and a higher price tag aren't an issue, then there really aren't many reasons not to get a blue-tongued skink. And we do have a whole video about them as well. But let's say that both insect feeders and space are an issue for you, but you still want a lizard. What then? Well, this! The gargoyle gecko. Gargoyle geckos, along with their close cousins, the crested geckos, were both on our original list 8 years ago. We kinda cheated because these two lizards are so similar in most ways as pets that we just counted them as one thing. But crested geckos and gargoyle geckos are not the same thing. And after much deliberation, like 8 years of deliberation, I have decided that given the criteria of this list, the gargoyle gecko is the better pet for beginners. Mostly, it came down to the criteria that it is unlikely to do anything that might discourage a first-time reptile keeper from wanting to keep pet reptiles. Because in most ways, what I have to say here will apply almost equally to crested geckos and gargoyle geckos alike. But there is one key difference. Gargoyle geckos regrow their tails. And unlike almost all lizards, their regrown tails are almost indistinguishable from their original tails. In fact, this is a regrown tail, and that's an original tail. And other than the fact that this one's not quite full size just yet, you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference. And this matters because having a gecko lose its tail can be a pretty traumatic experience for many keepers. And these geckos are more likely to do that than are the other lizards on this list. They can do it because they got scared by a loud noise, or rough handling, or it got pinched, or for a host of other reasons. Now, anything with a tail can lose its tail, but many lizards can just decide that their tails should fall off, and these geckos make that decision fairly easily. And then the disembodied tail wiggles and flops like crazy. And knowing that your gecko will, from this moment forward, always be different than it was before can be a lot to take in. And it sure helps if you know that a few months from now, the tail will be pretty much back, and in less than a year, it will be, well, you probably won't even be able to tell that it ever happened. It's just not such a definitive event as it is with crested geckos. Add that to the fact that they seem to be calmer on average and a little less jumpy. They seem to be less picky as eaters, and in my experience, they do not even want live insects, and it all adds up. They're just better pets for beginners than crested geckos. But the rest of this will apply to both, and crested geckos are certainly fantastic pets. Totally appropriate for a beginner keeper. Just not quite as good, in my assessment, as these. And the list of pros for these geckos is long. I'll start with their food, as that might be the best part of all. It's a powder that you can order online. I get mine from Bertopia Geckos, but you can also get it for a bit more at most pet shops that sell reptiles. All you do is add a little water and put it in a cup for them. It's largely fruit-based. It actually smells delicious, though I'm yet to try any. I guess what I'm saying is if you found the diets of all of the other reptiles on this list to be unacceptable, I reckon that this is the best fit for you. They're also pretty good to handle. They can and do jump, though I don't think as much as crested geckos. But once you spend a little time with them, it isn't hard to see the jumps coming as they bring both back legs forward and look very intently at the location they intend to reach. And being an arboreal lizard, they're pretty good at hanging on. They may leap off of you, but they're unlikely to fall off of you. And they feel amazing. Very, very soft, though probably not quite as soft as a crested gecko. Their claws are also generally in kind of a retracted position, so you will not feel them like you will with the other non-snakes on this list. And their enclosures can be very simple or very beautiful. It's easy to do what's called a bioactive enclosure for them with plants and insects that clean up after the lizard. And unless your home is very cold, they don't need additional heat. Any special lights will just be for the plants. And the enclosure doesn't need to be huge. In fact, you need it to not be too big, as they may struggle to find their food. So, a reasonably sized, often beautiful enclosure that's low maintenance. But they do have some cons. For one thing, they sleep all day, which is fine if you work all day, but there won't be much activity from your lizard during most of the hours when you're awake. I already mentioned the tail thing, but they can bite. I've never been bitten by a gargoyle gecko, but I've been bitten by more young adult male crested geckos than I have been by snakes, and it's not even close. It's generally because they're looking for love in all the wrong places and not malicious, but not something that most people would welcome. And the biggest issue, at least for me, is that they tie you down more than anything else on this list. You need to miss the enclosure daily and feed them every couple of days. I find it hard to be gone for more than a weekend without finding someone to care for my gecko. You could probably be gone for a week with everything else on this list, and as long as there's no concern of them running out of water, you shouldn't have much to worry about. So if you travel regularly and don't have a good reptile babysitter, gargoyle geckos might not be the best choice for you. But if you think that they might be the right fit, we have a video on them as well. And last on our list for today is the reptile that I was the most reluctant to put on this list. But after a lot of deliberation, I have decided that the super dwarf reticulated python does belong on this list. And before I go much farther, I want to emphasize in the clearest possible language that I am talking about the super dwarf reticulated python. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world. They are the only snakes ever verified to have eaten a person, and they do so with some regularity. I know of at least 2 people that were eaten by reticulated pythons last year. To my knowledge, no one has ever been eaten by a pet reticulated python, but they're a pretty terrible choice for a pet for almost everyone, let alone a first-time reptile keeper. Maybe not any crazier than many larger dog breeds, but crazy. And the thing is that if you go looking for a pet reticulated python, this is generally what you're going to find. Giant snakes. You do not want this. But other than being colossal, potentially life-threatening, needing basically a room in your house and eating small farm animals, it's a great pet. They're hardy. They are fantastic eaters. They are intelligent and engaging. And it turns out there are island populations of these snakes that do not get anywhere near that large. This one is Athena. She's about 8 feet long, which sounds large until you realize that these are long, thin snakes. She only weighs about as much as a large ball python, and she is an adult. And ball pythons were on our previous list. And, other than bearded dragons, they were the member of that list that I was least inclined to include, mostly because they can be difficult to feed. Well, if anything, super dwarf reticulated pythons like food too much. So I'm going to go through the pros and cons, and then I'll explain why I think that they belong on this list. So the pros are numerous. When you only have one snake, having it refuse to eat means that you're going to have to waste a feeder. And that is, in many cases, a waste of the life of a rodent. Well, these guys are almost never going to do that. Their size is wonderful and highly customizable. Different localities get to different sizes. Some of them are scarcely larger than a corn snake. But personally, I think that snakes around 8 feet are the ultimate. Handling them is engaging and immersive, but not dangerous or physically tolling. These and boas are probably the best snakes in that shoulders hug category. And they are so intelligent that it could be the only snake that you ever handle and you would never grow weary of the experience. I sure haven't. They might be the most fun snake to keep, period. They're also large enough that they're unlikely to get lost or seriously injured while you're handling them, or even if a child is handling them. These snakes are also very unlikely to get sick, and they are tolerant of many husbandry errors that a new keeper might make. But they definitely have their cons. This snake is likely to bite you, possibly in the face. It won't be quite the event that being bitten by a mainland reticulated python would be, but you don't want it. I have 3 dwarf and super dwarf reticulated pythons, and all of them have bitten people that work here at Clint's Reptile Room. Athena strikes at me almost every time I walk by the enclosure. They love food to a fault, but they are some of the sweetest and most tolerant snakes that I have once they know that you're going to handle them and not feed them. These snakes grab birds and bats in flight. When they detect something warm going by, they don't have long to make a decision about what to do. Quick decisions are not always correct decisions. But if you know that about them and find ways to show them that you are going to pick them up and not feed them, then they can be handled with little to no concern of being bitten. We pet our snakes with a snake hook before picking them up so that they know that we're handling, not feeding them. And as soon as they feel that hook, they totally relax and go out of food mode. All of our retics have bitten people that work here, but I know of no one that has been bitten more than once. One time is enough to teach you that when you open the enclosure, you need to communicate your intentions. I've never been bitten by one. And if you're going to be bitten, it will probably happen while it's young. By the time that the snake is an adult like Athena here, and a bite could be more memorable, you won't be a new snake keeper anymore. And you will know your snake. The reality is that after petting them with a snake hook, I am much more concerned with the other end of their digestive tracts than I am with the mouth. I have never been pooped on by one, but that is only because poop is almost always preceded by a large and explosive wave of urine that is difficult to miss. Athena destroyed my computer once with this. But like the biting, it's one of those things that is easy to avoid if you know what to do. They get a very conspicuous bulge before the vent if they have a big pee on deck. Athena here has one coming, but not right away. It'll probably happen sometime tomorrow. And Apollo, my other super dwarf retic, he's ready to go. That's why he didn't make most of this video. I've become so good at spotting it that I can take them outside to pee or even have them pee in the toilet. But the reality is that if they're going to pee in the next 12 hours, it will almost certainly happen during a handling session. So look for the signs and avoid the wave. They'll probably get you a time or two, but again, it will be while they're babies. This is still a rodent-eating snake, so those can be deal breakers. And this is a much larger snake than, say, the Cape house snake, so they will need larger enclosures, larger feeders, everything larger. And they're probably the most expensive animal on this list. But the dangerous thing is that they cost more to buy than do giant reticulated pythons, but they look basically the same as babies. So there is a motive for people to sell you a baby giant snake as a super dwarf, which would be devastating. As such, I generally recommend that people go to Reach Out Reptiles or other highly reputable breeders to get one. It's just too risky to go anywhere else. And this means that you're almost certainly going to have one shipped to you. But I can say that Reach Out ships reptiles better than any other breeder I have ever seen. And you actually have to reach out Reptiles in order to order one, so they can be sure that the snake that you get is exactly the one that fits your needs. But that is a pretty hefty list of cons. So why is this snake on this list? I would start by saying that a baby super dwarf is a totally fantastic pet for a beginning keeper. Other than Cape house snakes, almost nothing is better. And unlike their mainland giant cousins, super dwarfs grow very slowly. By the time it's this large, you won't be a new keeper anymore. You will know this snake and probably a lot more. But also, this might be the ultimate pet snake for most people that seriously enjoy snakes. It is basically perfect. The perfect size, the perfect level of engaging, the perfect eater, as hardy as snakes come. Perfect. If you really want a snake, a house snake, a corn snake, or a ball python is just going to whet your appetite for snakes. But the reality is that if your first snake is a super dwarf, it could be the only snake that you keep, and you're probably going to be a very satisfied snake keeper. If every time you consider a new snake, you ask yourself, what will this snake do for me that my super dwarf does not? The answer will often be nothing. So as long as you start with a baby and get an actual super dwarf from a reputable source, then it will be totally appropriate for you as a beginner, and as you become an intermediate or advanced keeper, you are likely to find that it is still the perfect pet snake for you. And we do have a video on them as well if these seem like the right fit for you. So 8 years after our first video, with a lot of changes to the reptile hobby, and after all that I have experienced in these 8 years, this is my list of the 5 best pet reptiles for beginners. There are some reptiles that, when they become easier to get, will likely make this list in the future, but after very careful consideration, this is where I am today. So which one seems like the best fit for you? What would you put on this list? I'd love to hear in the comments. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.
Rolling.
It's probably good that we weren't rolling. I thought you had a bidet.
Yeah, you did.
I just assumed it was because you didn't want to deal with your own business anymore. It's largely fruit-based. It actually smells delicious, though I'm yet to try any. And don't get any ideas, Jason.
If we hit 1 million subscribers, you will drink a cup of this delicious fruit-based food.